Hi, this is Paul, and I have a very special guest on today, Andy Littleton. Andy is a church planter in Tucson, Arizona, and he is a church planter that got into church planting through a friend of mine, Rod Hugen, who's been on the channel. And I met Randy when I was in Tucson when we were doing our little meetup tour before it got canceled by COVID. And I actually made an appearance on Andy's podcast. Is that Faith Over Breakfast? Is that what it's called?
That's the one.
Okay. And Andy has written a book along with co-writer Sean Bennis.
Yeah, Banesh. Yeah,
Benesh.
yeah.
Okay.
You know
And
what? Actually, he's just never corrected me. Maybe you just said it right, and he's never corrected me. One of those is it.
okay. And so I wrote I had a little blurb on the back, and I thought it'd be cool to have Andy just introduce him because I know, well, there's a lot of different kinds of people who watch my videos. Some of them are Christian, some of them are not Christian, some of them are Catholic, some of them are Orthodox. They're all over the map. And sometimes I get a lot of questions about pastors and church planters. And so I thought you've got an interesting story. And so I thought it would be fun to have you on and have you tell your story. And, you can, that can be a little promotion for the book if people like and are interested in what you have to say, they might be interested in the book. So let's
Hey,
do this.
I appreciate that. Thanks. Hey, by the way, where exactly were you when your tour got canceled due to COVID? I can't remember because
We were in Southern California.
you'd made it over to Southern California.
Yeah. And Job was staying with us, and he was supposed to have a conference for his work in Southern California. And the conference, everyone was started canceling, and it became apparent Job better get back to the Netherlands before the borders closed, and I better get back to Sacramento. And
Yeah.
so that was the end of it. We were going to go up to Oregon and Washington and British Columbia, and so none of that happened. But
Shucks. Yeah. So we had a unique experience here in Southern Arizona to actually get the whole tour,
that's right.
the whole experience. We got to experience what everybody else only longed for.
That's right. That's right. That's quite true. That's quite true. Well, Andy, let's begin with you because you've got an interesting story. So, were you raised in a Christian home, or what was your house growing up like?
Yeah, to some degree, yes. I mean, well, yeah, my family was a Christian family and a little bit of a unique one. I mean, a little more of a working class family. I look back on it and I view us as a little bit on the margin of the church, but we were there. There are a few reasons for that. Probably we didn't we didn't fit the kind of the socioeconomic group that was in church. We were a little more. I grew up in mobile home parks here in the States, and when you're kind of in that class and that culture, the church doesn't tend to lean in and relate as well. You tend to, at least the churches I grew up in, you tended to feel a little bit like an outsider, maybe a failure in the midst of that. And that was my family. We were in that space for much of my childhood. And
No,
my mom,
I'm gonna interrupt you.
yeah,
Not gonna be the last time. I think that's interesting because historically in American culture, uh, conservative Christians have tended to major in the lower socioeconomic groups. But I think part of what happened out west, I think that was true in the South and the North, but part of
mm,
what happened in the West was Christianity sort of started to hop over lower
right,
socioeconomic groups. And that has been continuing. Oh, you're younger than I am, but that has been continuing. That it used to be that conservative Christianity was sort of the ballpark of the uneducated, but that has changed quite a bit. So I'm really interested to hear your observations about the fact that churches didn't really pay much attention to, people who are growing up in a trailer park.
yeah. And it's interesting because I would say that a lot of those churches we were a part of, there are many ways in which we got some really critical support during some difficult years during that time. I would it's an interesting thing to look back on because I would say that my parents had a lot to offer to the church, but often felt like they, because of that socioeconomic layer, that they perceived themselves to have not done a good job with money, that they didn't put themselves out there, and the church didn't really lean into getting their input and things. So we felt like we were on the outside, even though we didn't feel rejected. Um, and I have a little bit of my life was in small town America, and that was different than when we moved into the city.
Mm,
So those are two very different experiences. And another piece that's unique is that my dad grew up a Lutheran, and my mom came to Christ in college in a Pentecostal church. And
okay.
so they didn't really relate to each other's traditions. So there was always a little bit of negotiating where if we were in a church my mom really related to, my dad would kind of, he would exist there, but he wouldn't really fully feel like he could participate. If we went to a church that maybe was a little more um, in my dad's vein, a little more subdued, my mom felt like the Holy Spirit wasn't there. And so that was another reason we kind of felt like we never really were in a space that was this good fit. So we were always kind of on the margins of the church, if that
Okay. Okay.
makes any sense. There's several layers to it all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you usually when kids get into like middle school, high school, they're no longer sort of following along with their
Yeah.
parents religiously. What happened with you?
Right. Yeah, that's very true. So when I was about 17 years old, I had a pretty critical moment for myself. I was dealing with depression as I look back on it, and I didn't know what it was. All I knew was I was at this point where didn't really I was starting to have dark thoughts. Those thoughts where you say, if I died, nobody would care, and things of that nature. And something I was at this I mean, I was dealing with that, and I knew something wasn't right. Something was off, and I didn't really know what to do about it. But I was at an event that I'd gotten involved with the church because I'd kind of followed a girl to church, which is probably how really most evangelicals came to be. But
At least the men.
then, right, sure. And that wasn't going well for me, that whole quest. But I was at this event, and a guy was talking about being this poor kid whose life wasn't going well, and the way that Jesus had made a difference in his life. And his story was different than mine. But I remember thinking, well, I'm not doing very well either because of all these dark thoughts I'm having. And so I went back to a hotel room I was staying with this guy named Tony, and we were watching the movie Boys in the Hood. So your typical conversion story during Boys in the Hood. And I was sitting there on the floor just contemplating it all, and I probably said the first real honest prayer of my life,
Huh.
and just said, God, I'm not okay. I'm not okay.
Hmm.
I guess maybe I need what that guy was talking about.
Hmm.
And that really started a trajectory of, my mom would say, I came home, I had a different aim about me. I was reading the Bible. I wanted to understand it. I started doing weird things as a 17-year-old. Like I would watch televangelists on TBN, and I would take their sermon, and I would take their text and what they said it meant, and I would go and I would write a counter sermon to it. And I would try to learn what, from with whatever resources I had, which wasn't a lot, but I would try to I would look for the things that made me uncomfortable or something in the sermon, and I would try to dig into the Bible and find the argument in the other direction, and then I would write a sermon that said that. And this is when I was 17, and I wish I still had these because I hand wrote them on lined paper.
Wow. That's
And
fascinating.
yeah, and then when I was 18, I got invited to be kind of a junior youth leader. And through somebody else's words, then an African American pastor said something in another event of some form, that some people were called to give their lives to God in a greater way, that they were supposed to go into ministry. And I went home to my little church community, and I announced to them that that's what I was going to do, that I was going to go into ministry, that's what I was supposed to do. And I actually announced from the front of this little church, a couple hundred people, that if they had a job, I would like to take it. And they, being as small as they were, put their heads together and created my first ministry job. So I started, and I've always been in some form of ministry ever since I was 18. But I had a really unique job. I had to visit people in the hospital. I had to help with the landscape. I played the bongos in the band,
That's
and
not such a unique job. Come on. A lot of our jobs have all this stuff in it.
yeah, and I took attendance and I did announcements. They just put it all in a pot, right?
Everything the pastor didn't want to do. I
Exactly.
don't have to do the yard anymore. I don't have to go to the hospital as much. Everything the pastor didn't want to do, let's give it to Andy.
And even more so because the pastor had just retired and they were looking for a new one. So it was, all this had been dumped on the music guy, and he was like, please, please. Yeah. So yeah. So that's how there you go. Then
There's your introduction to ministry. And you had all these hot sermons ready to go that were against other sermons. And
just all these anti-sermons. Yeah.
okay, what about educationally? What was happening with you then?
Yeah. So educationally, I just graduated high school and I'd gone into car audio. So I had this role in the church, but I also was installing subwoofers and PlayStation 2s and screens in the back of headrests and stuff. And so that had been my other plan, was that. And so I didn't really have my college fund. My parents had taken me to the bank once, and my college fund had under $3 in it. And in an act of semi-rebellion, I took the college fund out and I bought a cheeseburger with it. And so I devoured my entire college fund, and I was like, that's all, that's over. That's all. So I was going into the trades, and then I had this ministry call thing. So when that church hired a new pastor,
what kind of a church was it?
this was a Church of God, Anderson, Indiana Church of God. So this is, there are a couple brands of Church of God. One of them is more Pentecostal. This one's less.
Okay.
But in the Wesleyan tradition.
Okay.
And so that's just, like I said, chosen for all the right reasons, all the theological reasons I was there. And so that pastor, he saw that I'd really keyed into something. I actually, at that job, what I'd figured out, there was a middle school and a high school down the street. And when those two schools got out of session, all the kids gathered in our parking lot, and it was kind of an urban setting. And I would try to get all my stuff done so I could go out and play basketball with those kids and get to know them. And I started bringing some of them to the youth group. And he saw something in there that, that I was interested in, kind of this urban youth culture. And he knew I didn't have a clue what I was doing. So he said, look, maybe you should go and learn about urban ministry. And I said, like, where? And as I look back, I assumed he probably spent months researching this or whatever, but he goes, well, here's this one school in Chicago I've heard about. I called them and signed up. And they were, certain seminaries, including Calvin, would feed their MDiv students in there for an urban ministry.
Is that Scoop?
Yep. That's the one.
Yeah.
That's the one.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that program.
Yep. So and so being familiar with that program, just imagine 18-year-old, going, and now we're a little bit down the road. I'm not 18 anymore, but
you've early cut the church lawn a little while. You've done some things there.
Did a little bit. Early 20s, Andy, who's worked in car audio. I think I had an NIV study Bible at the time. That was about the extent of my reference material. I dropped straight into Scoop. And so we're talking liberation theology, we're talking all kinds of stuff, right? That I had no category for. I'm hearing things and I'm just in my NIV study Bible going, I don't know, like, what? I don't even know what's happening here. So that program, made me more orthodox than anything, because it challenged me to think. And I made a group of friends. They were kind of rappers and stuff. You'll see this, Boys in the Hood rappers. Uh, they were there was kind of this little group of young dudes who were going around to all the underground hip hop shows. Some of them went to Moody. So I made this little friend group there. And then I went to Scoop, and then I worked in a CRC church in Chicago, in South Chicago. So I worked for Tony Van Zanten. Yep.
Really?
Yeah.
So Tony was the pastor of Madison Avenue,
Yep.
Northside and Madison Avenue. These are the two churches in Patterson. And so,
Yep.
of course, I grew up knowing Tony Van Zanten and that whole crew. Oh, that's fascinating.
And I got to go over to Patterson with him. He took a little group over, and so I got to see the old church there, and that was kind of a unique experience. So that's where I worked, went to school at Scoop, and then had this group of friends from Moody. And between all of those, I'm discovering, I'm thrown into South Chicago. I'm discovering theology for the first time in a very unique, and so you could almost take a parallel of my counter sermons, thing. So then I would go to the Moody bookstore, and I was like, all right, who's John Piper? And I'd read that. And I read Piper on Justification by Faith while going to Scoop reading James Cone. And I'm just reading these two things parallel and trying to figure it out. And I'd never read theology before, right? And I dug into, I was just gobbling. I didn't know what to get, but I amassed books, and Moody bookstore, Scoop, CRC, all converged for me in Chicago.
Wow.
Yeah.
You got an education.
I got an education.
On the cheap in some ways.
On the cheap, yeah. And then years later, I ended up going to through an online program that was like Reformed Presbyterian. So now we're talking the complete other end of the spectrum. So then I'm reading Francis Turretin and Calvin and even Thornwell. Even kind of Southern slaveholding, like. Yep. I've read that perspective. Yeah. Yeah.
My mind is just going. I'm like, wow.
Where do we go from here?
What do you do with all of this? So
apparently you become bivocational.
That's right, because no tradition will have you. Well, except us. So anyway,
that's kind of true, right?
So okay, so you're going to Chicago, you're hanging out with Tony Van Zanten and Rosen Christian Ministries, and you did Scoop, and so all of that sort of primes you for something. Does your church take you back, or
no?
Yeah, they've spoiled you now.
They really didn't have the resources, and I got back, and they'd hired a youth pastor. They were kind of out of money. So, that's out of money. Plus I kind of grew up there. I thought about it like, this is the church where I used to sit in the parking lot in my little lowrider truck and pop my clutch and do burnouts and stuff. And, I look back and I go, I can see why they weren't like, you're the associate pastor now. I understand. That's what I was hoping for, though.
Okay. Yeah. Are you married or single by this point?
At this point, I was single. Yeah.
Okay. So you're back out west.
Yeah. And yeah, let's see. So that didn't work out. And then I went on kind of an interesting church journey. I worked for the Salvation Army.
Oh, okay.
That was my next stop. I worked there for a little while. And then I ended up at a PCA church where a good friend of mine worked. I was there 6 years. Then I did a 1.5 year internship at a church plant. That was a PCA plant. And then wanted to do something urban, wanted to get back to to something. I didn't want to be a senior pastor, but I was running into a dead end. And
Well, that's sort of where the rungs go, you know.
yeah, and I was working on an MDiv, but I didn't have it. So in the PCA, I couldn't do anything yet.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I basically got permission to plant with my small group, but it had to be just my own deal. And so I started a church with 8 people in a neighbor's backyard.
Well, about what is this, the 1990s by now, or?
No, now we're deep into now we're two. We just flash forwarded to 2014.
Oh, wow.
There were a lot of there's time in there. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
So, well, that's interesting because, of course, you know, I mean, church planting, if you look at these different church planting movements, I mean, you sort of cut across a lot of different church modes, let's say, because Scoop, there's a lot of, with my videos, I'm touching on a lot of things in terms of late 20th century, early 21st century history. And a lot of people won't understand that, you know, Scoop sort of rises out of, you know, evangelical appropriation of the civil rights movement, but it stays in church, because that's very much my background too. So Tony Van Zanten, you know, Patterson, all of that stuff, that's what I come out of. And there's a lot of awareness and desire to do urban church planting and urban ministry in a credible way that isn't just, let's say, sort of 19th century colonial ideas, which were sort of still present in the 50s and maybe early 60s when my father planted in Patterson. And so you've got all of this evolution on that score. But then so you have that wave. And then, of course, in the 80s and 90s, you've got the seeker mode, where running a church's business, we're going to plant churches in booming American suburbs, Bill Hybels, a safe space to hear a dangerous message. So you've got all those, and that really leads to the church growth movement leads to this huge explosion in church planting, especially, you know, that they try to leverage that all over the world, because after sort of the high water mark of church attendance in North America during the Cold War, it's declining. The main line is really cratering. Evangelicals are still holding their own, but they begin to realize there's a lot of cultural dislocation. And so you have this big movement in church planting where, you know, it's easier to have babies than to raise the dead. And so, you know, and of course, you know, if Rod were in on this conversation, Rod is a unsuccessful church planter in the Christian Reformed Church.
Right.
and he's just totally discouraged with the whole seeker thing. And of course, Rod doesn't look much like a seeker, skinny jeans pastor. And
I'm trying to imagine the skinny jeans.
I know. and so, of course, he's got, like, I don't know, less than a year's worth of funding, and he wants to give it back to Home Missions. And, you know, Home Missions is like, oh gosh, the paperwork, but just go out there and do something useful. And of course, he meets Eric, and then, you know, they plant the village. And of course, that whole crazy thing has been going on. So how do you meet these people?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I knew who Eric was because his dad was a counselor of mine. I met with his dad. He helped me process. I mean, a big question he asked me was, "What's with the chip on your shoulder against rich people?" And so that, you know, as you can imagine, having been raised in the trailer park and spent some time in Chicago, and yeah, I developed one for sure. And he helped dig into kind of this powerful spiritual foothold that I had around kind of a disdain for those with wealth. I didn't understand it. I felt ashamed around these people, but I turned it into a self-righteousness, if you will. So he kind of processed me on all that, in a couple of different settings, among other things. And so I knew his dad. And then the first time I met Eric, he was speaking at a men's event, and I didn't normally like these events. I tolerated them because I worked in a church. And I saw Eric Seepin, and I thought, oh, that's John's son. I've heard of this guy. And I went to his session, and it was just so different. He was coming at it from a whole different angle, and I really appreciated it. And several of the men in the room just looked like they just wanted to die, like they didn't get it. They were asking very strange, they were just like, what are you talking about? um and I was thinking, this is the best session I've been to all day. I can go home now. That was really good.
So what did he say that really grabbed your imagination?
Well, he was working out his table of decision, and have you ever heard it?
No.
It's kind of one of his discipleship methods, where it's kind of, you imagine that there's a table of decision. There's four seats at the table. You are at the table. Jesus is at the table. The enemy of your soul is at the table, and somebody from your community is at the table. And you're faced with one of your struggles, your temptations, whatever it may be. And this, I'm going to butcher it. He'll probably never want to see my explanation of this, but say Christ would say something to you like, that's really painful, but I'm going to have to ask you to walk into this, and I'll be with you. And your enemy goes, you know what, you don't need to do that. There's a pain-free path that you can take. Come with me. Don't worry. I'm not going to make you go through any of that. And this person in your community can help you discern between what is your Lord and Savior and what is your enemy's words, and can help you place your trust in the one who's calling you to move forward, but who's kind of terrifying to follow in a way. And I remember just thinking that through and going, that feels more like it. That's like what I deal with when I work with people. That's what I feel. And I just thought this is way deeper than kind of the rah, like, men need ministry with deer's heads on the wall, and, all this. You've probably seen these books, but I just was like, thank you. It's not just about like guys can get discipled in football. It was like, this would be hard to do, but this sounds like the work. And that was compelling to me. So then, flashing forward, that was back when I was at the Presbyterian church. I met him at that event. And when I was getting ready to do that plant with the 8 people in the backyard, we visited some churches that I wanted to have a chance to visit, because I'd always been working in church. And one of the ones we went to was the Village. And Eric said, oh, you're planting a church? He goes, you should talk to Rod about that. And I was like, who's Rod? And Rod comes over, this giant of a man, not wearing skinny jeans at all. And he says, do you want to get breakfast? And I was like, sure. And I seriously have had breakfast with him almost every week ever since.
I'm sure you have.
Yeah.
So okay, so you're going to plant a church, but now you're also not drawing a salary from these 8 people in your small group.
No.
How are you keeping a roof over your head and gas in your tank?
Yeah, and therein lies,
therein lies
the
book.
The book. Right. So, and I didn't realize how built in this was for me, but as I now examine the rest of my life, I see I've always kind of thought this way. But I obviously knew that we needed to make money, my family, to get by, but I did not think of church as an optional thing to be doing. I didn't look at it as if I have the salary, I will do this. It was like, this we need to do. I felt very convinced that the churches I'd been in preached a powerful and compelling gospel, but there were so many roadblocks to some of the people that I knew and loved ever showing up to hear this gospel, and in so many different categories, And I felt like we need to work on that. There needs to be churches where some of those roadblocks that are not necessary need to be taken out of the way. And
What kind of roadblocks are you talking about here?
a whole host. I mean,
Okay.
I mean, let's say that the only place where the gospel is presented is in church. I mean, that's a roadblock. And if you were to arrive at church, you have to enter into a completely unique culture with a whole bunch of rules that you would not understand. And if you grew up in church, you understand them and you can enter into that and exist. But if you didn't, and this is the one place where all this gets worked out and taught, it's really hard to enter in to this world. Um, Tiny things like there will be greeters at the door handing you little pamphlets with songs on them, and you're going to have to sing these songs that are very strange to you, right? Um, Things of that sort. Those are the small things, and then the jargon that's used when you're inside. The fact that even the whole place, just the look of it, and then not only the jargon from the front, but the ways that you relate to one another are strange. They're like going to another planet. People might call each other brother, and you wouldn't know why.
They hadn't just all watched Boys in the Hood. It
Yeah,
wasn't that.
yeah, no, yeah. Who's watching Boys in the Hood? Here, nobody. I don't even know what I'm talking about. So yeah, a host of things. It's just a whole nother world. And so I felt like there needed to be something distinct about the church, and the gospel needed to be preserved. But at the same time, some of these barriers could come down. Somehow you could create a distinctly Christian community that had less of those roadblocks, and then could go out in their community empowered to speak about Christianity in a natural way. Stuff like that. So yeah, so that had to happen. Basically, in my head, this needs to be, it needs to happen. It needs to happen really soon. We can't just keep dinking around. And so my immediate thought process goes to, okay, so since this isn't going to be a money-making thing, I got to figure out another way to have my family survive. And I also believed that a church that was going to be compelling couldn't exist if it wasn't generous to others. And so my thought was, I shouldn't, if this thing exists to pay me, that's the opposite of what we want to display. That's one of the roadblocks. We can't have that. So my gears start turning, and I thought, well, over at the Presbyterian church, I got known for, I went through this hard time in life there, and I had remodeled a house while I was on hiatus from the church, basically. And I came back, and that's a whole nother story. But the people there discovered that I could do remodeling work, and I started to get people, older ladies in the church would say, hey, can you fix my toilet? And I'd go, yeah, I can do that. How much do you charge? Oh, I don't know, I'll figure it out. And I started to figure out, that I looked back and I said, people used to hire me for things. I'll bet if I reached out to them and I told them I'm planning a church, that they would recommend me, and I could probably get by. And my dad had an 85 Toyota pickup, and I knew he didn't really like it because it had some little quirks. So I said, hey, well, would you sell the truck? And he goes, look, you can just have it. And I was like, great, I have a truck, I have customers, let's go. And my wife is going, okay, right? And but yeah, I got jobs, and I eventually got recommended to a coffee shop, and they hired me part-time to just do, they had several locations. So then all of a sudden I'm rolling. I've got work to do, plenty of work to do. And so I was kind of a handyman. And I just toolboxes and a rack on my truck. I just was this rolling handyman. And the great thing is I'd come into marriage counseling in that crazy little 85 truck with a bunch of wood on top, and I'm dusty, and I'd sit down and, so you're getting married. Okay. And it was kind of all one motion. I yeah, I began to kind of live out something I wasn't even thinking of it as bivocational approach. That's just what we did. Um, and sometimes it'd be, somebody's like, can I meet with you? I'm like, well, I'm changing light bulbs over there, but if you want to come and hand me light bulbs, we can talk.
Little bit of free assistance along the way if people want to talk
Maybe,
to you.
maybe that happened. Yeah, I don't know.
So this is 2014 when this started. Now that's already 7 years ago. Gosh.
Yeah.
So what's the status of things now?
Right. So I did that for a bit, and then I began to hire a guy who was also a part of that small group, and we started to work together. And he was far more technically skilled than I was. I'm great at sawing the bottom off your gate or whatever, but he was very detail oriented. And um, in the coffee shop world, they were opening a new store, and they let go of their project manager. And they asked me, because I was doing all these things, they said, do you think you could get this project through to completion? I said, yeah, I think so. And so there were a few things that needed done, and I'd hired this guy who was in our small group. And I said to him, I said, hey, I think you could do some of this stuff, and we could do it together. And I'm managing the project, so I think we could do a couple of these elements rather than me going and finding somebody else. So we ended up making this kind of beautiful mesquite wood bar and stuff like that. And his expertise really made a difference. And we got a phone call from somebody. They said, we saw that bar over the coffee shop. Was that you? We heard that was you. And I said, yeah, that was us. And could you do something like that over in this ice cream shop we're opening? And I remember thinking, uh-oh, like, I'm no longer a handyman. Like, this is commercial fixtures. Like, this is a whole nother category. And as a handyman, you can work under a handyman clause and keep your jobs under a certain amount. And you don't need a license, but it was like, I need to figure all that out. And I probably need like an LLC or something, And so in there, as I began to look up all the rules and file for all the things, I realized, this isn't a handyman shop I'm creating. I'm creating something that's fine craft. If we're moving toward doing more of that, and if this guy and I keep working together, this is fine craft. And so we ended up turning it into kind of a fine furniture and fixtures business. We tried to steer a little clear of install unless we worked under another contractor or something. But it became a pretty well-known company here in Tucson. I look back on it, it's kind of wild. And then we ended up starting a small store out of it, a furniture store. We thought it'd be nice if we could sell stuff we regularly made. And that was kind of difficult to keep up with. I thought it wouldn't be a problem, but as the jobs, we started doing bigger restaurants and custom home stuff, and keeping the store populated was difficult. So eventually we ended up partnering with somebody else on the store who was kind of into curating home goods. And so she would buy stuff so it could kind of accent our stuff. So then there's a small home goods store. And then this past year, because of COVID, actually since the writing of the book, over at the furniture shop, I mean, we got hit really hard. We were doing restaurants, we were doing a coffee shop, stuff kind of ground to a halt. So we actually downsized Midtown Artisans, that company, and I just transferred it to that other guy I worked with, who is the lead craftsman. So he owns it now, 100%. And I stayed on with the store because it had kind of morphed into a new thing. And so I at this juncture, I'm a pastor. Somewhere in there, I got picked up by Resonate Global Mission as a mission network developer, which makes some sense because I was on some business associations and stuff like that. And I co-own a home goods store. That's how it sits right now. Yeah.
Why did you write the book?
Well, I think so. Sean, the co-author, he's done a lot of writing. He's a professor. He's done a lot of writing around social entrepreneurship and church planting, with kind of a bivocational, co-vocational approach. And his mom lives here in Tucson, so he comes to town, and he planted a church here years ago. So he found me through some networks years back, and I wrote another book too. And this is about my father and kind of a journey to process my father's death in a way. Um, but I was in Oregon where he lives, and when I was there, I looked him up and we got together. And I remember asking him a question. I said, "So you write all this stuff about bivocationalism and social entrepreneurship." I said, "Who do you know in the church world that's really doing it?" And I'm asking because I want to follow this person,
Right.
or whoever these people are. And he's like, "You." He's like, "You're doing it. You're probably one of my main guys that's doing it, that I am kind of referencing." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." And we did a little podcast together while I was there. And then he came back down to Tucson, and he looked me up, and we got some Mexican food, and he said, "Hey, do you want to co-write a book about that?" And there we go. So it was his invitation. And I think he kind of awakened in me the fact that I actually knew something about this. I was looking for someone to read about, and he was saying, "I think you have more experience in this than anybody else I know," which isn't true. There are people who have more experience in it, but um, that he knew it was true. And I was surprised to be viewed as an expert. Um, that was very alarming to me. And then Nick, my co-pastor here at Mission, he's also bivocational or like quad vocational or something. He's kind of crazy. Like, he's got a lot of different things going, and crazy in a good way, like in a unique way. But he and I went to a CRC and RCA hosted event on micro churches. And a lot of the discussion there was about side hustles and being co-vocational. And we kept realizing when we were there that we had way more experience than a lot of the folks in the room. And that was alarming. That we went, really? Again, we tend to still think of ourselves as being about 22, I think. I don't know how that happened. I don't know if that happens to you, or if there's a threshold where you start feeling older than you are.
Your hair falls out.
That's when it happened.
Oh, I used to have hair. It used to grow off the top of me. What happened?
Okay. So that's how, okay. Yeah, I still think of myself as a very young church planner, but I'm creeping up on 40, and it hadn't dawned on me that I actually had going on an interesting, almost a decade of experience doing this bivocational thing. And I'd gone through a lot of the mistakes that other people might make. And yeah, so writing the book was me leaning into, oh, maybe my story has some value for people out there exploring this.
Now, there might be some people listening to this that say, I'd really love to. Well, let me ask you this question. Why plant a church instead of just going to one?
Right. Yeah, I asked myself that question. That was a big one. And I think the answer for me was that the work it would take to change an established church culture, not that it's not worth it. It could be, but that work would distract you from the goal if you're really trying to get out there amongst people who didn't know Christ and who weren't predisposed to being a part of church culture. Like, to turn this ship of another church, you'd have to be placed in a position where you were invited to steer the ship. Then everyone on the ship would have to get on board with that. And that's going to take a long time. And that's a worthwhile quest, but it wasn't the one I felt I was supposed to be on. I felt like I needed to get out there. And to do that, you kind of needed a fresh community of people who were on board with this vision now.
So what is the vision of your church that that might not be in a church that someone shows up at some random thing in Tucson and says, "Hey, you're a church. This is a church thing. What does your church do special that you need a whole new church to do something special?"
Yeah, I'm influenced in this. This is something that we've toyed with and we're just now articulating really clearly to our church, honestly. And this is I'm borrowing this little bit of illustration from another pastor who ran a similar style church for decades and is now retired. But the vision would be being an outpost within the world of the church. And so that is that, an outpost is connected to a broader whole, but it's out on the edge, specifically positioned in a place where you might need to take the message or receive in people who are on their way in. So if you think about an outpost, if you were on the frontier, right, you'd have this outpost that's far away from mission control, far away from the fort, where you send people and they're gonna be advocates out into the vast unknown. And also people could come to the outposts and learn about the people back at the fort. So we think of ourselves that way as a church, that we are connected to the church as a whole and committed to that. But we are also positioning ourselves on the edge. So and the people we want to deal with are those who are kind of walking up to the edge of Christianity and peeking in and saying, what's in there? We want to meet those people. And then the Christians who are kind of going, I am a little uncomfortable with this. I think I might distance myself. We want to meet them there too. And so we're intentionally,
They're a little uncomfortable with what?
With what's anything going on in the church, or they're hurt, they're thrown off, they're not sure if their beliefs
So
match up.
people may be wanting to get in and people who are thinking about leaving.
Yep.
That's who you're talking about?
And we want to meet those people.
Okay.
And you need an established group of committed folks to do that.
Yeah.
And you're going to expect a lot of hurt people. You're going to expect a lot of stories of pain. You're going to expect a lot of divergent opinion. You're going to expect to not have everybody there all the time. I mean, we struggle with, those are the problems of the model, but that is the vision, is to be an outpost church, positioned on the edge intentionally.
So in your experience, so you've got people out there that are curious about Christianity or maybe considering it in terms of something for their lives. What are their motivations?
All across the map.
Well, let's hear some examples.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, so this is a conversation I had this past week. I've tried everything, was kind of the conversation. I grew up in what we would call a cult early, got out of that early, tried a lot of mysticism, a lot of things. And this person was saying, I could feel that there was darkness and that something was evil. Like this, unique story, right? And
there's a lot of people. I'm really curious because I hear a lot of stories too. So I'm just curious what you're hearing. I'm comparing notes here. So keep going.
Yeah. So this person's saying, I've felt the evil out there. I believe there's a God, and they're kind of moving toward, probably like the Orthodox Christianity thing is new. Like I did the cult stuff. I did the
small O Orthodox. You don't wear vestments and stuff.
No, correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Just want to be clear because I got a lot of big O Orthodox people who watch this channel. So
yeah, hey, and that could work too. That could work. But yeah, they're going. I tried. I grew up in like more of a cultish world. I tried kind of this mystical stuff. It felt dark and wrong, and now I'm going to try this Christian thing that was always there, but I never tried it. So that's a version. I mean, we have a lady that came to Christ through our church, who was very much in the self-help world, and was feeling a hollowness, a shallowness in that. Had some pretty incredible, kind of that unexplainable stuff where she, yeah, she tried, there was a little bit of church background in her family. And so she kind of tried some prayer stuff, is on a hike, sees a cross in the ground and the earth. So, stuff that I never preach, like, here's how this works, by the way, that, this is just what I'm hearing. And then walks into our church in the middle of, we were in an 8-week series on the basics of the faith. We were in the last one, and she'd come to town, connected with a friend, and said, I had these experiences. I saw this, visualized this cross. I'm oh, and she had a psychic tell her to pursue Jesus. And so she's like, what should I do? And her friend says, there's this church you should try. So she comes in, and at this random, it's like a Monday night little gathering. There's 4 people there. And one of the things she'd tried is she'd walked the Camino de Santiago. Turns out 3 of the 4 people in the room, I was the only one who had not walked the Camino de Santiago. So she walks in and is sharing some of this stuff and how she walked the Camino, and the rest of them had too. And they just hit it off. And then we dropped our whole curriculum for the night, and we just explained how, what Christ does that's different than what the other religions offer. And she just was eating it up. And one of the ladies in the group who walked the Camino said, hey, would you want to get together and do some hikes? They started following up. And one day that lady just said, it sounds like you want to follow Jesus, or something to that effect. And she's like, I think I do. And she did. And she's been with us ever since. Right now she's out of the state, but she joins us on Zoom still. So that's wild, right? And then, and great moments of being reformed where you go, well, that clearly wasn't because of my vision as a church. Like, we didn't
This
do
is
it.
our target group.
Yeah, we were just there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, things of that nature. I mean,
so is it better or worse to plant a church bivocationally, or well, I think the truth is it's harder and harder to plant a church any other way these days.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's not easy to do. It takes time. It divides your time. I mean, that's a fact. Well, enough with the negatives. There are some downsides I think anybody should be aware of. It divides your time. It can be hard to balance things. It can be a little hard on a family potentially. The upsides are, it can give you an inroad into the culture that is natural. For me, that business got me in the lives of so many other people. I think in a lot of our city, I'm more known for that than for the church, and people relate to that. They relate to being in business. And so I've noticed when I've been introduced to folks, say in a coffee shop, and they go, this is my pastor, that's a great way to shut down a conversation in a city like Tucson. But if it's, this is my friend Andy, he owns Mesa Shop over at the Mercado. Oh, we have a rapport, we're going somewhere. A lot of people know that I do both. And I think that's a really unique opportunity, because they have this layer that they can understand through which we can enter into relationship. But then some of those people have called me when they've had something going on in their life. And they've said, you're a pastor, right? Do you talk to people?
No, I'm a pastor. I don't talk to people. It's the one thing I won't do. Is talk to people.
Possible. Yeah. And it's opened a lot more opportunity. I think a lot of that remains to be seen in my journey. There are folks, I think it's a very long haul type of ministry we're doing, where if you're engaging with folks who, I'm kind of a paid a lot of attention to how Keller talks to people over the years because of the group I'm trying to engage with. And one way he's described it is, some people have all the furniture through which Christianity makes sense. And some people, the furniture isn't there. And you have to start by introducing the furniture. And I think those kind of discussions are very much in play. And I don't know where they'll end up in another decade. But there are people that I've worked with and known for years that I would not have any contact with if I'd only planted a church in my context. And so I also think it helps relating even to the people within my church. There are just some interesting dynamics where a lot of times the pastor feels like he has this very different experience in life. You're in your office, you're studying, you're praying with people. You don't know what it's like to be me. I've got employees, they drive me insane. Well, I actually do experience that stuff. So I've got these very secular motivations I have to deal. I need a profit margin, right? I need my employees to be on board and on time. I get those stressors. I get what that's like. That I experience those things as well, and timelines that go wrong. And I think that there's a bit of relatability that comes with that. Yeah.
Do you think you want to grow out of being bivocational, or are you going to do this until whenever?
Till the sun don't shine. I assumed early on that it was a temporary thing.
Hmm.
And I was really faced with that this past year when thinking about downsizing the custom shop, because that was one of those moments where you could say, look, now's where I'm done, and move on from it. Two things. I really felt a loss in letting go of that company and having ownership over it, because it was a huge piece of my journey, of my strategy. I mean, there was a lot of, I loved what it did for the greater good in a way. I'm very proud of a lot of the things that we did. And so it was hard to allow it to not be mine. And that was surprising to me. And on top of that, when I thought through what would be lost in my connection to the community by not having any other avenue of relationship, and that's probably why I stayed pretty committed to holding on to the store, was I didn't think it was worth it. And when I looked at it, what would I lose as far as the mission of our church if I didn't engage in secular, regular business? The cost was too great. Even though it does take some time and it complicates some things, I've decided to stick with it. So I also recognize that, hey, I'm like I said, I'm getting toward 40. I'm not there yet, but my capacities are already less than they once were. So I'm sure
Oh, don't say that.
Yeah.
Are
you telling me
Rod's 10 years older than I am, and he's still doing stuff.
Right. Right. But the amount of stuff, I don't know.
Yeah.
I imagine that someday in another 10 years or so, I may look at the situation and go, well, I can't do that anymore. But I still will value the time spent in these two worlds no matter what. And I could very easily see myself doing both for a long time.
What do you want to see your church become?
Yeah, I'd like to see it be a couple things. I mean, one would be a launching pad for people who, in a sense, do what Nick and I do, where we are very committed to ministry, very committed to our work. I mean, that's something we just want to see the people of our church do as well. We want them to see their work as one of the critical bridges through which they take the gospel and exemplify the gospel in their world. And so I would love to be able to just recount a number of folks that begin to function that way, where things are not compartmentalized, but very integrated. um, I would love us to, and we're kind of working on this, to catalyze other people that have what we're calling out of the box missional ideas, things that don't fit in the category of missionary or minister. Because there are a lot of folks that have thoughts like we've had, such as, this would be a really great business. I think that people would really engage with Christians in a space like this in a unique way. So we'd like to catalyze more people to do those sorts of things and be a church that launches people out and maybe even teaches other churches how to think that way. Um, I think we want to see people come to know Jesus who are on those margins. We want to see people who were going, you know what, I don't like the church and they don't like me. We'd like to see them be surprised and find themselves getting rooted and grounded. We'd like to see some of those people that peer in, um, saying, okay, I'll test the waters with you all. I just had a guy at the church the other day. He said, he, and this is, I think, the way he phrased it. He said, my family are liberals. And he said, I've always known I couldn't bring my mom to church.
Hmm.
But he said, I think she'd like you guys. Okay. That's music to my ears. I want to hear that kind of, that people who are willing to peer in might go, you know what? I'll try you all out, because some of those barriers have been dropped. Um, yeah, we also, for whatever reason, with that kind of outpost thinking, we've felt the need to develop relationships with the broader church really intentionally, and that's actually given us a surprise mission of bringing churches that weren't united together. I lead a pastors group of 35 pastors here in Tucson, and I never viewed that as part of our mission, but we've now adopted that idea that that's a part of our role in our city. So we want to be a connecting point for people who are on mission together, that help them understand each other. And it's something about our church's weirdness. Yeah, we're kind of weird, and but they know we're Christians, and so we kind of have this unique little voice into a lot of different church traditions, because we don't feel like we fit one of those categories. Yeah.
How do you think the gap between the church and the world around you got so broad that people can't really understand what's on the other side of that gap?
Yeah, a lot of reasons probably, but I think one, there's two stand out in my mind that I just experience with folks. One is that a lot of Christians are mad at their neighbors
Hmm.
for wrecking their country and their life. And it's really hard to lovingly reach out or listen or deeply know somebody you're subtly mad at. I think that's a, and then the other side of that, and maybe it's really just two sides of the same coin, is just being afraid that if I reach out and know these people well, I'm going to fall into some, be it a sin, or I'll or I'll lose my distinctive character as a Christian. I see that a lot, just a fear of getting too close to people. And I tend to say, I remember saying this to a Mormon missionary once, and I said it to him, and now I sometimes doubt if it's as true as I thought. But I told him, I said, in my Christian church, nobody ever tells me I can't talk to people with different opinions. Um, they don't make me go out supervisor. They're not sheltering me from the world. And that's because we don't have anything to be afraid of. Um, and I told him I was concerned for him because he didn't have that opportunity. And that is how I felt within the church. I wasn't just, it wasn't like, don't talk to those people. There was a confidence in God, um, that was like, God is sovereign and he's going to hold you fast, and the the scriptures are strong, and you don't have to worry about somebody pulling the rug out from under you. And I feel like some of that, there's a fear, and maybe we're not as sure of that
Hmm.
these days, to where we don't, I don't know, we've all got, we're staying away from everybody. And that's not helpful. Yeah.
How's your church going, especially now a year into COVID?
Yeah. So it's been such a strange year. I I think in some ways, I think that we're dialing in that mission of what we're supposed to do and supposed to be really well. That's come at a little bit of a cost. Just I when I talked to our other leaders in that pastors group, I realized it was a common experience. Every single one of our churches has experienced some form of division this past year. I don't know about you, but there was one of the categories got every church, whether it was
Hmm.
how you approached COVID, how you approached the discussion about race, or how you approached the election. And even if the church didn't go after any of that stuff, the people did.
Hmm.
And I first saw it manifesting on social media, where I saw two of our people questioning each other's faith. Um, and I happened to stumble on that.
Hmm.
And and that's when I realized we as a church need to lead them through this.
Hmm.
And that's going to be complicated. Now, because of the way that our church works and the diversity of thought and background, I think it was probably magnified for us. But I think for a group within our church, there's been a real like pressing into all of that, and a willingness to hear one another, listen to one another, that's really strengthened us. And then I think for some folks, that process has made them go, I don't think I'm really up for it. So there's been a little pain. But interestingly, we have, and then this is the COVID layer. So we have a cautious in-person version at this point, and then we have we've got our rolling TV with all the Zoom faces on it. Um, and we're having them there at church where we can see their faces, and that's getting old,
Yeah.
it's totally getting old.
Yeah.
But it's work, for those who are convinced they need to be home, we can honor that. For those who feel like I really need to be present, we can do a version of that. But we have some people who are feeling that, like, they're newer to our church this year. They really feel integrated, a big part of our church. I realize some of those faces on the screen, or those names on the screen, are like, they were there at the beginning. Some of those people have been with us from the beginning, and this person who's been here for 6-8 months has never seen them before.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, what does that look like? I mean, and how much attrition will just happen because of the lack of ability to be present. Eric and I just did a faith over breakfast, kind of processing how we're feeling about this, because you just don't know what it looks like when you come out the other end, and there's no
Yeah.
way to know. There's no way to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that
What
is sort
what's
of,
that like in Sacramento, man? What's
well, I I think a lot of us are sort of, I mean, some churches, we've, for the most part, sort of stayed open quietly and very
Mhm.
small. Most of our members are watching the live stream, and we haven't had, the only incident of COVID we've had was one of our members who works for the state, and a lot of people in Sacramento work for the state. So he goes to work every day, and he probably picked it up at the office, but he wasn't coming in for services anyway. And we've just kind of had usually somewhere between 5 or 20 people in the room, but we've got plenty of space so that they can spread out. So I'm convinced that we've been doing it responsibly. Um, but I think there's a sense of, a lot of people are sort of holding their breath, not knowing what the other side looks like and what the path to the other side looks like. And in my congregation, I've got a fair number of older people, and the some of them I haven't, they haven't been here for a year, but this year has been more. I mean, when you're in your 70s and 80s, a lot can change in a year. And this year has been harder than most on a
Right.
lot of these people. So there's some real questions in my church as to what the future looks like. Some of our church plants too are sort of holding their breath, not quite knowing what the other side looks like. And so or even what the path out of this looks like. Will, now in California, if you're 65 or older, you can get a vaccine.
Right.
Some of our people who are getting vaccines, who have gotten vaccines, are now feeling a little bit more confident to come back to a in-person worship service. So, a lot of momentum that we had, partly perhaps due to the videos and some other things, was sort of lost because
Sure.
of COVID. Our meetups have been on and off, and they're probably going to be off until, whether, we can meet outside with some confidence or vaccines. So it's still pretty tenuous.
Yeah.
And, one of our church plants might be losing their facility where they were renting before COVID. And so they might move in with us. That could be interesting because I don't know where that would go. But that could be a good thing. So there's just a lot of uncertainty.
We have a church meeting in our building they actually planted around the same time as us, but they lost their facility. So we're sharing our building with them, which has been really cool to be able to do. Yeah, just kind of a unique time. We Last year, one of the things for us, for you, is you've got your older folks waiting for vaccine, and we have a few older folks, but not many. Most Our main demographic is 20s and 30s. So for us, we've got those who are very committed to being very cautious, um, that are younger, and then those who are. So I've described our church as like on all the various spectrums you could have. It's been like a 10, 40, 40, 10, a 10% very committed on this side, 10% very committed on this side. So you've got your people who are like, I will not be back to church for 4 years. That's an exaggeration. And then the people over here that's like, if you make me carry one extra piece of cloth on me that even resembles a mask, I'm never coming back to this church again. Whatever, it's
No, no, I get that.
there. And then we've got this 80% in the middle that, 40 lean toward caution, 40 lean toward not as cautious, but they all are generally, they're like, look, we're all in this together. We're getting along. We're going forward.
Yeah.
So, a lot of our people that aren't back are like highly committed people, I think, but there's still this hard part where I'm like, but I haven't seen you for a year.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
strange.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you'll be back.
Yeah.
We've talked on the phone, we've, kept in touch, but there is a sense in which this is accelerating change for a lot of people, especially seniors. And so I think we've lost some people just because they knew that after the end of the year, they weren't going to drive that certain amount, or maybe they're not driving as much as they were before, or they want to find a church closer. So
Yeah.
it's
Because you were kind of a destination church for some CRC folks that maybe didn't have to drive as far as they did, but they chose to or something.
Yeah, and we are now, um, the church is a little over 60 years old from before it organized to when it organized itself. So you've got people that started going to the church when they lived in this neighborhood, but then moved out to another
Yeah,
neighborhood and keep going to this church.
right.
And
And some of them may not come back home.
some
Yeah.
of them may not come back. I wonder with some of our seniors if will if they ever will. I mean, some people are just getting used to, I just turn on the TV.
Right.
And,
Right.
there's Pastor Paul, and I check off my church thing. It's like,
They were like, this is what it was like to just subscribe to his YouTube channel.
they don't
Pretty
watch
great.
my YouTube channel. I don't, I have no idea what they would think if they watched my YouTube channel. It's like, what's he talking about? Every Sunday morning can be a little fuzzy about what Paul's going on about, but the YouTube channel, that's all the fuzzy stuff. I don't know what Paul is talking about. Why would I want to watch that? So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the outcome of this looks like, but yeah, we'll see. We'll see. It'll
Yeah.
come. So
That's another, I mean, if there's another little thing about the bivocational side of things, another thing that I'm grateful for, so our whole staff is bivocational. It's five bivocational staff members at a small church. So the nice thing is you get to share the load, but another thing is there is a little safety net for, like, if something goes horribly wrong, your eggs aren't all in that basket. So I don't think any of us feel like if our funding dried up, this church can't go on.
yeah,
It would be hard. It would be terrible. We want to be an active, generous church. It would really inhibit that. Like,
yeah,
one of the best things we were able to do last year is we stewarded $10,000 worth of mini grants. We stewarded almost $5,000 worth of World Renew money. We really did, like, help our community during COVID in incredible ways. And that's built into who we are. We want to do that. But if funding dried up to some degree, or we took a hit during this time, we wouldn't all have to go look for another
yeah,
church.
yeah,
And that's a gift.
yeah.
That's something that kind of comes with the strategy of potentially doing a couple of things. Yeah.
It's a very common pastor's crisis to get into, that, the church closes and the pastor has, I mean, I've been working ministry since 1990 full time. I haven't had another job outside the church for 31 years. Put
Right.
that on a resume.
Right.
So Living Stones, and Living Stones is, Living Stones is struggling in terms of viability. And, so my wife works for the Sacramento City Unified School District. Christian Reformed Church is a particular thing. There's not going to be another Christian Reformed Church opening up in Sacramento. Does Paul try to play? But with the bivocational aspect, you're far less, you've got less vulnerability in that space. Right. So
there's a certain amount of insulation, and it keeps you connected to the job world in general.
Yep.
So there's just, when you take that job insecurity piece away for some pastors, and I haven't really ever experienced that, but I've watched people who have.
Yeah.
I've watched planters who were on denominational funding or whatever, where it began to dry up, and it's hard to be about your mission when you're just trying to decide, like, are we going to be able to pay our mortgage next month?
Yeah. Yep.
And then there's nothing worse than becoming begrudgingly bivocational, which that, right? And you're just kind of mad at your church whenever you're at your other job. You get that job at Starbucks as a 55-year-old, and you're like, yeah, you don't want that. I mean, why not plan for it and do it in a way that builds up your church and contributes to your mission? That'd be ideal.
Yep.
Yeah.
I remember there was a time when, my father's little church in Patterson, it wasn't doing so well financially. And I remember hearing my father talk about, I could probably get a job for garbage collection, sanitation in Patterson. And I said, Dad, you work for a black church. These people would be horrified if they saw you chasing behind the garbage truck on weekday mornings. I mean, that would probably shame them into putting money into the plate, because of course in the black church, I mean, pastor needs a new Cadillac. He didn't start working for Patterson.
Yeah.
He didn't start working for Patterson Sanitation. It must have worked out, but I do remember that times are changed. So that's about all my pestering I have for you. You have any pestering for me? Is there anything you wanted to ask me? I mean, you had a chance at the podcast, but it's been a little while.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, when it comes to I want to ask you on the bivocational topic first. I think, how many people do you really interact with who are thinking about that in your church circles? Is how important of a topic is this? And do you know anybody who's doing it well? And you can't say me, because
Because you're
I'm just
taken.
best. I'm not. I don't even think I'm an expert.
I see in the Christian Reformed Church, this has historically, bivocational has not been
Mm,
something people aspired to or saw the value of, partly because of the Dutch tradition that it's the church, it's the job. The pastor is a professional.
right.
There's educational demands on him, and this is the job of the church, is to support him. And if a church isn't adequately supporting their pastor, that's a shame on the church. And so that's been a big piece of CRC culture. In the Black community and the Hispanic community, I've, just by virtue of, I've had relationships with, Tongan churches, Marshall Islands. I mean, here in Sacramento, it's tremendously diverse. Most of those traditions are bivocational.
Yeah.
And so many churches have that as simply assumed. The
Yeah.
majority of churches in America are less than 75 people. Most of those churches cannot afford a full-time Christian minister. And so I wouldn't be surprised that if you had to look around, most would be bivocational.
Mhm.
So now, that having been said, there's a lot of different thinking about that. And it will be interesting going forward. It'll be interesting going forward to see the way this thing goes.
Yeah.
I know it's come up a lot with church planting, and there's good reason for it. Right now, many churches, even who have a full-time pastor, those pastoral families are functionally bivocational because the pastor couldn't make ends meet without a wife who was actually working
Right.
another job. And many church plants, I see that, where in reality, they're kind of leaning on her or him in some cases, leaning on the income from the other person. And so, in my situation, if Living Stones, let's say, can no longer afford a full-time salary for me, traditionally in the Christian Reformed Church, I would just put my name up and other churches could recruit me, and my wife and I would relocate to another place where I would then become. But my wife has a full-time job in Sac Unified School District. She, you know, she gets far better benefits than I would from the Christian Reformed Church. So we're on her medical benefits. She has a pension program. She has all of these things. And actually, she now makes more money a year than I do.
Yeah. I just recently, I think, surpassed my wife in how much I make at work, and that's partly because she reduced her hours.
so so then it gets down, and so now I'm doing this YouTube thing. And so then this is I think very fruitful ministry. I mean, that from the emails and messages that I get from people, they're very appreciative. So this is very fruitful ministry. So, and I'm also closer to retirement than you are. I'm 57. I could retire at 67, but maybe push it to 70, let's say. Um, so I'm sort of at that place in my career. And a lot of people, when they get to my age, it's very interesting because it used to be that once you hit your 50s, you're in the gravy run of your career.
Right.
And a lot of people now I see get into their 50s and early 60s and their careers just dry up.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to hire them at that point.
Right.
And for many people, especially because you're not going to get on Medicaid or Medicare until later, then they have a crisis of medical coverage.
Hmm.
And then they start dipping in their 401 401k.
Yeah.
And it's there's a lot that's going on. And I would expect that in the Christian Reformed Church and in many churches, bivocational is going to be the norm, because the church world is just in that much transition, and COVID will accelerate that.
I
So
agree. Yeah, it already feels like that's the case.
yeah, yeah. And
Um,
but I do think there are a lot of good reasons to pursue it. And people keep asking me if any of my sons are going to go into ministry, and at this point none of them are looking at it. But if any of them would decide to do that at some point, they've all got day jobs now and they all have careers, and so I think it's actually it's a very wise strategy.
yeah. So next question. I think the thing that struck me when you came through town and picking your brain just a little bit about YouTube and who's there, and because I was in the position where I was like, I don't just sit around and watch YouTube videos. If it's not actively telling me how to fix something in my house, I'm not really there. And so I was sort of saying this to you and saying, look, I might take in a podcast from time to time, but who in the world is listening to an hour of just a conversation? To me, that was shocking because it's not what I do. I'm having this one with you, but I won't. Will I even listen to it? I have no idea. But
I'm hurt. I'm
I,
not hurt at all.
um, but what I realized in talking to you is that there's a huge group of folks who are out there who might be listening while working or while doing other things, and they are taking in these conversations, and it's a very important space in which to be. And so I've come away convinced of that, even willing to dabble in it.
Well, you got your breakfast over your your podcast.
I've got the podcast, got a couple of podcasts, yeah. And so that said, I've come to view you as doing some of what our church endeavors to do, of sitting in that outpost space, but for you it's online. And for us it might be more like physically located in spaces, but for you it's online, and we're even trying to learn from that. So as someone who's been sitting there having these conversations, what are the biggest questions and biggest roadblocks you've identified to people engaging with the church? Roadblocks to engaging with the church, questions people have.
There are a lot of people that will simply have zero idea what on earth is going on inside a church and how that relates to the rest of their life.
Totally. Yeah.
And I think so. Actually, actually before I was talking to you, I was working on, say, I want to put together a series of videos, something closer to a class, about what I've learned over the last 3 years.
Hmm.
Because even though no one, before I got onto YouTube, no one within the church world would have probably accused me of having led an insular ministry,
Hmm.
just by virtue of where I've done church, foreign mission experience, the churches I grew up in, just how I've always been a reader and a questioner and curious about people. But there are deep divisions. This, in some ways, this whole church enterprise, you really have to get sort of at least waist deep into it to have any kind of idea of how it might be useful or what it means. And there are so many basic questions out there that keep people so far from any of this making any sense at all.
Hmm.
And there are and I love I love how you led this off with the trailer park, because increasingly that's true. It used to be in the country that it was only sort of the elites and the intelligentsia who were reading philosophy or those kinds, and the vast majority of people sort of were carried along by folk religion.
Hmm.
So you had some people who were working in churches, and then you had folk religion underneath that was sort of connecting the two, and
And they
especially
sort
in
of
America that was
tolerated
working.
each other. It seems like those intelligentsia pastors got assigned to the churches, and the people of the folk religion were like, well, I'm sure you know what you're talking about, so you
Yeah.
can, yeah.
But that folk religion has been displaced by self-help,
Mm,
social services, the alcohol and drugs, those have been around a long time. Now we have fairly reliable electronic distraction
yeah.
through TV, media, video games,
You can find
and
any answer to any question you may have
that's
really
right.
quick. Yeah.
Or at least one that sort of works good enough for you now to get you over the moment of anxiety that you have.
Yeah.
But
Mm,
in some ways, what the church is selling, increasing increasing members of the population look at and say, I have no idea how that relates to anything in this world.
mm,
And pastors, I think, are going to have to probably work harder. And I think Christian leaders are going to have to work harder to help translate a lot of stuff back and forth. And there's way more competition for that.
yeah.
Now, so I was working on, I love what you said about the divisions in society, because those divisions are in the church.
Oh,
Right now, there are so many churches that are, I talk to some people and they go to a church on the other side of the divide and all they hear is social justice, social justice, social justice. And it just grates them.
mm-hmm,
Then you've got churches on the other side that are, go to heaven, go to heaven, go to heaven. And
mm-hmm.
it's like, well, I ain't there now.
Yeah. And does this have any relevance to, yeah.
Yes. So there's a lot going on right now, and I don't see the church as doing particularly well with this. Especially now I think it's actually doing better at local levels, like probably in your church, you're managing it. But when I look at a lot of the media talking level out there, it's just going like this.
Mm,
And I think that's a problem, because generally speaking, pastors on the ground sort of feed off of the those who are writing
mm.
books and making content. And I'm not surprised that you went to this guy and said, I really need role models, and he's like, "No, you're it." I
Right.
remember early on in our Sacramento church clustering phase, we were, they were just a bunch of young church planters, and they're like, we really need someone to come in here and show us what to do. And so we said, went to home missions. It's now Resonate. And they're kind of like, no, you guys are kind of it. so, so I, so, really where this whole YouTube channel developed was I just needed conversation partners to think out loud, and Jordan Peterson sort of opened up the
Mm-hmm.
opened up the conversation in some big ways. And so now I am talking to cognitive psychologists who are non-theists. I'm talking to people who are getting into big O orthodoxy. I'm talking to Roman Catholics. I'm continuing to talk to people that are more on the evangelical. It's funny because every now and then I'll get a conversation like, you don't really talk to evangelicals, do you? And I would say, no, it's just you don't notice that they're evangelicals because you swim in that water. If you were over there in this camp, you'd say, oh, Paul's talking to an evangelical.
Right.
So, and even that term evangelical has become part of a food fight
Yeah. Yeah.
that, again, I've been reading George Marsden's book, Fundamentalism in American Culture. And, in the 1870s, if you were Protestant, you were an evangelical.
Right. Right. Yes.
And, and so when I hear all this talk about white evangelicals, I'm thinking, you don't realize how y'all are tinkering with these labels and what those consequences are going to be.
Yeah.
because I see a lot of things in the media about, oh, all these segregated churches. But when I look at a church like yours and look like Rod's and like mine, it's like, I'm not sure race is the biggest segregation point we have going here.
Right.
Even though I'm not saying race isn't an issue, and that there aren't issues about race. I mean, I've seen that all my life. I'm just saying we now live in a place where for a lot of people, their predominant formation is coming through certain mediums.
Well, and it's personally curated.
Yes.
So the predominant form of, I've thought about it this way, and I actually have to go to get my daughter from
Yep.
softball in a little bit, but we'll pull this together. I've thought about it this way. In the past, it seems like there used to be, you kind of picked your institutions and you picked your head people in the institution, and you assumed, yeah, I'm going to get a lot of information from this person. So maybe your institution was your church and your paper and whatever, and you kind of allowed them to feed you what they thought was best. And I'm sure there were some holes in that, right? But today it's, I don't know, you could call it, a product of hyper individualism or moral therapeutic deism or whatever you want to call it. But there's this, everybody has their personal curated pastor, if you will, and it's a conglomerate. It's not a person, it's a conglomerate. So I like how this person says this and this person says this, and you kind of put it together, and it's like, this is my thing. This is what I submit to, but it's personally curated. And everybody's got a different one, and it makes it very difficult to be united and move forward together, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Which makes it very difficult for local churches.
Yeah. I've realized, and I've been saying this over the past few years, that I was taught that being a pastor meant you were going to have this flock of people that look to you and you were going to teach them,
And they're going to listen to you.
Yeah. And I've realized that this flock I have looks at me generally, and they're not trying to do this. This is just our time. And they say, so what is it that you're saying? And you say it and they go, that's an interesting perspective. I've heard a lot of other ones though, and I'll think about it. Yeah,
that's a very different thing from a church 100 years ago.
So different. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Very true. I don't know. I don't want to keep you, from picking up your daughter. You're a busy bivocational pastor.
Hey, that's right. And she doesn't tend to smile on it when she's the last one, standing outside or whatever. At least it's sunny today. The last time I was a little late, it was raining. That was really bad.
Well, Andy, we will land the plane then. And I, again, really thankful that you agreed to come and talk, because I did really, Paul, you don't have enough evangelicals on your channels. Well, here's one, and he works part-time and, part-time pastoring. And I wanted to give you a chance and let people know who you are. And I'll put your church website and some of that stuff in the comment section. So if people want to come find you, and you're in Tucson, Arizona, so
Yep.
Others might want to knock on your door, and they can't knock on your door now, but send you an email. So
yeah, well, they can knock. Whether I'll be there or not it's hard to say, but you can knock on the door and send me.
That's true. All right, Andy. It was great talking to you.
Good talking to you. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.